Did you ever like Northern Exposure was a whole show that people were obsessed with in the 90s, and it was
Yeah,
very that's in our
I thought it was Canada.
I mean, it might have been pretended to take place in Canada, but it was filmed like 50 minutes from where I grew up. Same thing with the Twin Peaks Cafe was 15 minutes from where I grew up.
Oh yeah, Northern Exposure. Yeah, it's got a moose on the thing.
We do have moose meese
Yeah,
in
it's a fictitious town in Alaska.
oh, and well, Alaska's not Canada, Geography 101, but
I mean, same difference.
sure, Seward's Folly. We should have never bothered acquiring it.
When I said Canada, I meant north.
You meant north. You
Yeah.
meant the former Yukon territories.
I mean, technically, Alaska's not really American anymore, with Putin raising his head. Yeah. Sorry, that was
Sarah Palin can see him from her
yeah, there was
backyard.
a Sarah Bailey shout out right there.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
How did we get onto Northern Exposure?
Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the chat from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. We're also here to get deeper in the human element. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people to do that than Kevin and I.
Which is why we really need to get some more guests booked on here. If you've got a topic you'd like to come discuss or rant about, drop us a note and we'll see if we can get you on a future episode. You can go to acceptancepod.com/guest and submit your ideas. And a quick reminder, whether this is your first episode or you've been listening for a while, we wouldn't say no to your going and dropping 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving us a nice review. And if you want to leave us a bad review, remember the name of the podcast is My Brother, and Me. Also tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there go by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it.
And a friendly reminder that we are always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app updated everything and is now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. You can send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com or submit them on the Discord in the User Stories channel, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking to a coworker or something.
On this week's show, we'll hopefully help some people out with some more Reddit questions. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call User Stories, where we'll eventually hopefully be answering questions that you, the listener, send in. But for now, I think we found some interesting questions on Reddit that we can tackle. Psychological Draw 909. Are you actually coding features in software engineering? I love the personal project phase, but I think I'm about to be hit with a reality check when I graduate and dip my toes in software engineering. You're not actually coding features. For the most part, you're maintaining it. I honestly want a career where the bulk of my job is coding new features and prepping myself and building projects of my own, but I don't think that's possible unless you're in an early startup, which is only applicable until the application is built. And one of the replies from Test Driven Mayhem: if you only ever make new features, then you will never truly learn the craft. Changing software to adapt to changing requirements is far more challenging. Learning to craft applications with a low cost of change is one of the most important aspects of this. This is not maintenance or updates, it's craftsmanship. I thought that was a pretty good answer, but I do think that there's this weird balancing act that people need to figure out in software development, which is it's a balancing act. You're absolutely going to spend a week troubleshooting a bug in old code and not do a single interesting thing. And you got to balance that. That's like that all jobs have a little bit of crappiness. I don't know. Like this is just, I'm slightly cynical at this point in my career. There are parts of your job that are just, don't look for that to get your own personal satisfaction out of it. Like engineering is that way. Product management is that way. Plenty of jobs have zero satisfaction and you just are doing a thing from 9 to 5. So the fact that you're in engineering and these creative fields, UX is this way, there's plenty of opportunities to be super creative and interesting. Just don't expect that to be all 40 hours of your week. I don't know.
Yeah, I do actually like Test Driven Mayhem's line of thinking, right? But again, the challenge with all these, they can feel very general, right? So I think Test Driven Mayhem's sort of advice applies nicely in a general situation where it's like, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for taking somebody else's code and there's just value in that, right? Like seeing how somebody else tackles a problem. Maybe it's more optimized than yours. Maybe they found just a better algorithm or whatever. So I kind of like I kind of like the reply. It's funny. I've been thinking about this one for years. Because I'm not married to my code. I've never been married
Sure.
to my code, and I've never been married to. Maybe it's because I came through early startups where you quite often vaulting. Like even if you're successful as a startup, sometimes your early products are getting vaulted, and a lot of it's your code, and you're like,
Define for a second vaulting.
oh, it's never going to see the light of day, right? Like it's dead project. So you keep the code around, and somebody you sort of think to yourself, well, I'll steal this, and in 20 years, I'll release it later. But yeah, so I had a conversation even recently with a friend where I gave them the advice. They were sort of really taking some of the feedback on some of the code and the architecture, maybe personal. It's like it's not it's not personal. I've written code where I've been like, this is so hacky, but it's solutions and it's moving, it's moving the client along, which is what they want. But I've never really cared whether I was building new features, tracking down some weird bug in some race condition in somebody else's C++ code, which is not my expertise, but it was just fun, right? It was like, yeah, I was learning something new. So yeah, I don't really understand that selective engineering.
Yeah, well, and I think it feels to me like you need to do some self-analysis of what is it you're getting out of writing the new feature. Is it the problem solving? Is it the creativity? Is it the creation? Like identify those kinds of things and find them in the things you're going to be asked to do in a software job, which is, yeah, you might be taking someone else's 5-year-old, 10-year-old, hopefully not too much older than that code, and trying to add something new. And I think that's where Test Driven Mayhem's getting to. Like, there's creativity in figuring out how do you work around all of the weirdness you find in this existing code infrastructure, this code architecture. When you realize the way that you can go and add the new module, tweak the existing feature, do it, that's a creative, I don't know, this is where like maybe our brains of pattern matching, I'm finding that even when the task feels not creative, because to me the creativity is the discovery of the answer, and that's the thing that is interesting to me, not the fact that I got to write 100% of the code. It's that I solved the problem of how do I fix the problem, how do I add the new capability to the existing code base, all of that kind of stuff.
I think there's plenty of opportunity there too. To your point, like if you think about my problem with some of these posts too is like I often when I see feature conversations like this, I wonder if it's somebody who's like working in an interface where it's like, hey, it's exciting. Like I'm releasing things and the customer's using them. But I think about like, well, what if I determined that the legacy backend system is too expensive to replace, but I get to write an abstraction layer between that backend system, and so that's new feature development work on top of the sort of maintenance layer, right? So there's opportunities to still get that new feature newness, like it's my design, I'm using latest tech, I've provided an abstraction layer. So yeah, so maybe this is a narrow view that wasn't explained in the original post. It could be somebody who really enjoys maybe seeing their work in action, right?
I mean, it sounds like it's a college kid, right? Who's only ever had to make their own personal projects and do college work and is looking at how am I going to go find a job that's interesting to me. That's also a thing. Interviews are not a one-way street. When you're interviewing with a company and trying to find that job, ask them those questions. Make that part of your criteria. There's going to be a balancing act of you're 22 years old. The opportunities in front of you are probably slightly more limited, so you don't get to be fully exclusive, but figure that out. If you're going to go work for a massive corporation and the job feels like it's going to be maintaining internal tools that are used by 100, corporate people, that's a different experience than going after a company who's, trying to sell consumer software, offer a company that's doing B2B software. Like, you should be understanding that in your interview process as you're trying to find this job. And if you do have the opportunity to pick between 3 roles, pick the one that seems like it's going to be more feature and new code development. I don't know. There's degrees of this where you can still figure that out as the type of company that you're going to go possibly work for. That's an interview process.
The interesting thing here too is every single junior engineer kind of goes through this, right? Like yeah, sometimes you have
Right.
an unorthodox entry to the industry, like you and I, for
Right.
example. But like we often started off the junior engineers with APIs and like, okay, these are your personal projects to settle in. But they all transitioned and they got new feature development. But yeah, like it seems like maybe the original poster here has like the climate might be the actual essence of this question, right? Like where can I go where I'm going to be working on new, constantly rolling out new features? And I
Right.
don't think it's as simple as saying early startup, because you and I probably both have startup
No.
experiences where it's like you're gridlocked. Like I've been at one where it was like, when did you last release? 8 months ago. Eight
Right.
months ago. How are you still in business, right? So it's not as easy as just saying go to a startup and you can do new features, right?
Right. Well, and also a good, healthy company, again, ask this question in your interview process. A good, healthy company with a software engineering team is going to have opportunities. It's going to have hackathons. It's going to have time set aside for personal development and that kind of stuff. So find the team who's open to you saying, yeah, 2/3 of your job is going to be maintaining and updating limited capabilities within an existing stack. But find those, ask your manager for the opportunity to go and say, hey, by the way, we keep talking about this thing that we never get around to doing. I'm going to spend the next 6 months in my 10% flex time working on the brand new UI, the brand new API call, the brand new whatever, and it might not go anywhere. That's the other thing to your point about it might get vaulted. You need to be okay with it scratching your own personal itch. It may not be a thing that you ever get to see released. I don't know. Yeah, it feels like this person just needs to do some self-analysis. Why is it important to you to write the new code versus what is that mental itch that you're scratching by doing that, and look for those opportunities.
Hey, and the good news is, if Psychological Draw 909, if you're that talented, trust me, like there's never been a time
Right.
with any engineer, and I've had interns who were out of this world, and we trusted them and we protected them because we didn't want them to be exposed in production. Actually, there's just
Yes.
legal considerations when that's happening. But it doesn't matter whether you're an intern. There are good leaders who will identify good workers, and if Psychological Draw 909, if you're that good and you're developing great code, you're going to have a lot of autonomy very, very quickly, because that's what we're all striving for as leaders, is to identify those people who can run and move and go and build new features and own whole requirements, right? With many features.
Right.
So yeah, talent will show, right?
Yeah. I mean, you know who I'm talking about when I talk about we gave a brand new, like 23-year-old
Yeah.
developer the opportunity to do a link library feature, and he came back and had developed an entire MVC version of the app and was working on how to figure out how to integrate it so all new features took advantage of the new framework and they weren't stuck in the old framework, which at that point was like 5 years old. And every new feature got built in his framework because he took the time to highlight all of that. So yeah, shine how you need to, and if you find a company that doesn't recognize that, then that's you're in the wrong company. But that's, I don't know, my experience has been sort of what you're saying. You usually can find the people who are going to recognize that and let you go with it.
Yeah, and it's actually good for your career too, because you think about a lot of the times as you get older in your career, you're not even necessarily job hunting anymore, right? It's just the next call you get. So that particular person that we both know, that's the kind of person you would call and say, "Hey, we have a brand new, like,
Right.
like open for design and your influence to come in here and impact a company," right? Like that's what you get from being talented, right? Is that autonomy and control.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so next question. Great name in this one. Good Jovi. Finally, somebody with a simple name. Good Jovi.
Do we think it's because Bon in French is
It's
good, so Bon
exactly
Jovi?
exactly where my mind went. And that sort of question, yeah, it is a question. How do you keep your enterprise system architecture diagrams up to date? Amazing question. So my organization recently hired someone to create this gigantic architectural diagram with all the applications and the integrations. I can see the benefits of having this kind of artifact. It looks good, and it does provide a high-level view of all the systems we have and blah, 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 blah. But the problem is the moment it was created, it already became obsolete because the changes happened on
Right.
some of the systems and integrations. My question is how do large organizations maintain this kind of architecture diagrams with the speed of changes introduced? It seems overwhelming just to keep it up to date. Okay, cool.
The answer is they don't, right?
Yeah, yeah, they don't. However, they can, but I don't want to make it sound easy. So
Sure.
one thing is that you can do is you can get really crazy with the Cheese Whiz, and actually, as part of your build process, you can take something like the C4 standard, and you can actually write pseudocode to generate your diagrams, right? So I think C4, even in Microsoft, what's the studio they have?
VS Code?
Thank you. VS Code. So there's extensions in VS Code today, so I can actually have my diagrams as code.
But in theory, but the point is, this isn't a thing that is like, it is not, technology is not to the point, I don't think you need generative AI, but even machine learning scanning of text, it's not to the point that it is just going to detect the change you made. You as
No,
an
it,
engineer still needs to go and write a little config file?
no.
Oh,
So
okay.
and I'm running through various options, but they're not all like for like, right? So I could be
Okay.
coding, and then I could go the extra mile, right? And let's say it was all coded, where it's like, cool, I've got a service discovery, but as part of my service discovery, it also reports back to a database, and then the documentation knows then, oh, cool, when I'm building this pseudo code to build my diagrams, I see a new relationship in the database. So you sort of keep in the meta.
Which I feel like Calibra and LeanIX both want that to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, isn't that stuff that
Yeah.
they want the
Well,
hooks to be plugged in?
yeah, and those types of tech, they already do it, right? Like, so like for an extra 50 to 100,000, I can go get the module that is sniffing
Right.
components on the network. And there's a lot, again, with the Venn diagram, like the NetOps teams will have a lot of tech like this too, right?
Sure. There have to be versions of that though that I could just add an API call to
Yes.
my build statement, so I don't need to have the full $550,000 component,
Yeah.
right? Anyway.
And this is it depends how sophisticated you want to get on the integration, because exactly what you said, right? Let's say every single API I ever write as a call home to some database somewhere, which is like, cool, we're getting boilerplate. So every time someone builds a new service, they got this boilerplate code, and it always emits an event, or it emits something.
Right.
So yeah, technically you can code it into, and that's kind of like that Dr. Watson, right? Like if you think about like how Microsoft used to work, they're all sort of calling back into this centralized location. So totally possible. However, a lot of the enterprise architecture tools now do that, right? So the meta model is important to an enterprise architect because it is the source for the diagram. So you won't get it all the way through the levels, right? But I can go from business context all the way down to a data object if my meta model is complete enough. And that will update. However, you've switched the versioning and updates from the diagram to the meta model. So it's got to make sure my meta model's up to date, but then I can generate my diagrams from the meta model. And that is native to enterprise architecture design tools.
But it's still on someone's job. Like, someone still has to go, and that's the thing. This has always been the thing of product sometimes is on the hook for that, and it's like, yeah, it's that annoying task I should do at the end of definition of done before I close out the epic. But of all of the things that people want to do, that kind of documentation is like, it's the last thing people do. So what are the things? How frictionless can you make that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing here is Good Jovi is talking about a very specific diagram too, right? And I know because I have the
Sure.
same diagram. I call it my architecture reference diagram, which is like, this is everything, but it can't be logical because it's everything, or at least the big pieces. Yeah, those I probably go back once a year on those reference
Right.
architecture diagrams, right? Because I can still show, I can still say, hey, ignore this piece. That's not the direction we ended up going, but all of this stuff still applies. The ones in the SDLC, like the ADRs and the design docs, those are the ones that are hardest for me. Like those are the ones that are the most challenging because yeah, they don't get the updates.
No, it feels like the normalization of deviance, in which you do it well for the first 4 sprints because everyone's on board, the benefits of it, and then the crazy bug comes in and you've got to push the thing really quickly, and you do the pull request and you get it out into prod really quickly, and oh, at the end of that we forgot to do the update to the diagram, but that's okay because we did it Saturday morning at 3 a.m. and no one wanted to do that extra step, and then no one did it on Monday, and now, well, you didn't do it on Monday, so I'm not going to do it on my next one, and it does, like, that's the thing I'm sort of curious about, is like, what is, aside from the true automation, unless you've got 50K to do this, what are your best practices to enforce this?
Yeah, and it's funny actually. This goes back to the ServiceNow question too. If if Burbell 2013, it goes back to if their service now has all of those IT assets in, right? Again, I don't know ServiceNow well enough. I know other tools,
Sure.
but now I can start to generate my diagrams, right? Because I'm dragging and dropping. So if you imagine a company that's been really religious, where it's like, oh, all of my applications know their applications and they all report home, and then my data objects inside all my data products are addressable, and they're all I can locate them whether I get them from Calibra. You can just scan these API endpoints and they're addressable and discoverable, right? If you were super religious about capturing all of those entities, like the instances of those entities, then yeah, tying them to your enterprise architecture tool would be amazing, because now you're running into, oh, cool, I'm getting the meta from the application that allows me to generate the diagram. That's a level of sophistication I haven't seen.
Right. And what do you, I think you're always going to be competing for priority. I need an engineer to spend, what is it, a sprint working on the base project configuration and build configuration to make sure that that kind of stuff automatically runs. It depends on the organization you're in. Have you convinced all of your stakeholders that this is basically car insurance and I'm not going to give you any benefit to it tomorrow, but you want me to have done this and you want to have spent the sprint doing it now, so when we have the problem in a year and a half, we're not dealing with the consequences.
And again, that's great. Yeah, because that leads back into the maturation level, which is my organization the type of organization that I can go out into and say, hey, I want
Right.
to standardize all the designs for ADRs consistent. And actually, it's a project that we just recently started, myself and a couple of other architects, which is to come up with the diagramming standard first, because we want to tackle this in the next couple of years, which is I should be able to go to the repository, right? Like the meta model and see all of these diagrams and see the different pieces of architecture. So it's definitely
Right.
it's not so hard that we've given up on it, but I can tell you that when you reach that level of sophistication, oh boy, right? It's something else, right?
Yep.
And that I haven't seen it yet.
No. Well, and I think it's one of those, it takes a certain type of, I don't know, thought process person who wants to tackle that problem. And so, like, one of my very first jobs, I was 19 in Boston at an ad agency, and I spent my first week on the job being given little tasks to go and troubleshoot things and just like learn the code base and do all that kind of stuff. And it was wildly frustrating that no one could tell me the overall, like, why does this depend on that? And so people were super puzzled in my second week on the job. They hear the printer going crazy because I'm printing 20 pages, 8.5 by 11 pages of the entire database diagram that I'd built out in SQL Server's old diagram screen that you could build, and printed it so I could reference, okay, this table is dependent on that table, which means I can't make this update if that one has, and like no one could tell me that. And so like I literally, it was a joke in the office of like, oh, this new kid's weird, what is he doing? And I was like, no, I'm fixing all of your bugs faster than you did because I can now see this. Like there's so much benefit to doing it, but you need to have the person who understands that.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, and it's often it's a weird. There's a weird. There's been a weird shift between. I don't know if you remember, but the build release engineers, right? And
Yeah.
a good build release engineer, there's sometimes a gap between the new DevOps and the old build release engineers. So a lot of DevOps teams will play with it and look at something like a Sonar Cube or a code complexity, sort of platform.
Sure.
I love it when I work with a good build release engineer and I'm onboarding and they point to something like, hey, we got Sonar Cube and we scan all of our builds, because as a new developer, for me to be able to look and say this class is 75% duplicate with that other class, oh cool, probably entities then, like what copy and paste code. It makes it so much easier when I can see that dependency. And I don't know if you remember, like Visual Studio, the architecture version,
Yeah.
used to have that, right?
Yep. Yeah, I feel like I'm not criticizing DevOps necessarily, but DevOps, by making itself a specific practice, has also sort of isolated itself from the day-to-day of the SDLC. It's this weird thing where like they were people like your release manager and your IT person, and they were like, oh, we need to make this a better practice, so we're going to turn into DevOps, and then are rightly complaining that they're now back outside of the SDLC and trying to get back in. And it's like, yeah, I need you guys, you've turned yourself into a reactive organization with aims of being proactive, but your engineering partners no longer think of you as a proactive member of the team. You're now this other thing, and it's screwed you a little bit.
It does. It's a really good observation, because I often say DevOps were the first ops group to sort of break break into the SDLC, right? Everybody was and a
Right.
lot of ops still. You always say FinOps, right? Sec DevOps.
Yep.
DevOps were the first to break in, but yeah, they sort of broke in, and then it's almost like they got pulled back out again, where it's like, all right, cool, we've got
Right.
it, and we're going. And then they started accepting stuff that was non-engineering work too, where it's like, oh, are
Right.
you guys doing IT work as well? Because we don't see you on the SDLC side, but then yeah, you do. It's almost like DevOps has killed the build release engineering function at a lot of companies, but
Right.
then not taken on all the roles and responsibilities of like the build and release.
Which is, I mean, that's the problem is every company should have 30 more people than it does. And we're not willing to, we want the 20% EBITDA instead of the 10% EBITDA. And all of these business decisions based on shareholder return make you decide that I'm not going to just pay the 12 people to do the work, that I can cheat and pay the 7 people to do the work. And it's like, okay, but we have lost things by not having those 5 people
Oh yeah.
be the person who spends time just getting your build and your release process going, actually spending time QAing things. Like,
Yeah.
it's a weird trade-off that the executives don't care. They save money and they all got their golden parachutes out the door. So yeah, it sucks.
That goes back to your question, like what's the EA value? I can tell you what one of my like biggest sort of statements is when I'm working in a big company and we get into that situation where it's like we're doing something and we're under resourced, right? And companies are planning, and I'm like, how are you planning this? Like, how do you
Right.
how do you know how many resources you need for next year? There's no way this information you're looking at is correct. No way
Right.
it's complete. How are you running a business on it?
Well, and their answer is like, oh, the PMO does that, or that one product guy who's paid attention to everything, right? Like
Yeah.
they make it 10% of someone else's job, and then they're stunned when that doesn't actually yield any good results. Because no, that is not criticism of the people trying to do it. That is criticism of you gave them 10% of their time to try to do it.
Yeah. And that to me is the nut, right? Is if I will feel good the day when I'm talking to an executive and they're like, so you tell me it's going to cost like 12 million and it's going to take 5% of the engineering and IT guys offline for 2 quarters. Like, yeah, that's where I want to get to, is like, it's like fact checking, right? It's like, you want to do this for 2026 and I'm telling you that you're 33% crazy because of the numbers, right?
And it's this weird thing where executives will, like, risk and compliance is a whole department for a reason.
Mhm.
Legal has input to all of that, right? And so, like, there are entire parts of the business that are so risk averse and they put everything through that correctly. And then there's weird situations where, like, your entire revenue forecast is vibes from the sales team with no risk or accountability. Your entire engineering and product roadmap is vibes based on hopefully some data-driven decisions, but no one's actually tried to be structured in the way that they think about the actual dependencies and trade-offs, and no one's helping you make those decisions. And it's this weird thing where, like, you don't need to do that when you're 12 people in a startup. You're just naturally, hopefully, because you're all talking constantly, that just hopefully is naturally occurring in the best startups. But at a certain point, a company transitions and you need to actually make those decisions. And you get to the size of companies that are thousands and thousands of people, and they're like, oh, we're agile and we have a startup mentality. And it's like, no, you don't. No, you don't. Because otherwise you'd be baking that into all of your conversations. It's this weird blind spot that companies sometimes care about risk, but then other times don't. I don't know.
No, that's absolutely right, and that's where the EA lives, right? The EA lives in
Right.
that, and will continue to be a challenge for the rest of my career, right? There'll be some companies who bring in EAs, and then like, oh, first team to go EAs because we don't know what they do, we don't understand. It's like, again, you know, environmental, right? Did you get top down buy-in? If you have a good leader who's like, no, we absolutely need you guys. Not gonna be easy, but you've got the runway, right? You've got the time. So yeah, some of it's environmental, but I totally agree. Like, I always joke and say, I really just want to put some science back into computer science. Just some.
Right.
Just a little.
I want to put, like, I need the person who appreciates why insurance is good. I like the person who doesn't, like, you're the type of person who gets like the bare minimum bronze Obamacare healthcare plan and your car is insured for no extra liability. You can't be CEO. I'm sorry. You're making bad life choices that influence your decisions here as well. You don't understand the value of that.
I love that you use that example, because I used that example about 2 weeks ago with an enterprise architecture team, and I said, look, I know at times enterprise architecture can feel like the life insurance. I was like, but
Right.
trust me, 3 of the 4 members of this family are going to be so happy when they get the
Right.
life insurance, right? Like,
Exactly. Yep.
And it is just like that, right? I think going back again, the most frustrating thing for me is when I get places and people are like, "But there's nothing wrong," and it's like, well, one, there's no such thing because there's no place in the world that doesn't have some kind of improvement, and two, look around, right? Like. We can't get data from A to B. Teams picking their own tech. AI turned on all over the place. We got code leaking. We get
Right.
scans, vulnerabilities. It's like, what is good? Cool. Your face-to-face conversations are enjoyable. Awesome.
Well, and there's a version of that which is like you think you're at a 9 and you think maybe Gary could do his job better to get you at a 10. It's not your fault because you're a perfect little snowflake, but we're coming in to tell you, I'm not telling you, like, I'm not here to be down on any of it. I'm telling you my assessment is you're at a 7, so let me get you to what a 9 really should be, and you're going to realize, oh, actually, now I feel like I'm at an 11. Oh, shit, I was at a 7.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right? Like it is, let me show you the difference because you're not aware of the differential and where you're actually at.
Yeah, and I think a good EA practice too is going to elevate that next level, the next level down. About I shouldn't say, I don't mean down as in terms of like that lower, right? But that next level down where you get into the domain level expertise, right? I think my philosophy has been you have to surface those guys and build that mesh of solutions architects as well.
Right.
And that really complements EA. Certainly when you're doing innovations too, like if you're doing evolution or revolution, then you really want to be able to get the SAs singing the tune, right? Like this is where we're going. This is the promised land. And then you really want those guys to be like the early adopters and early trained so that they're going back to their domains and train. So I think that's really key for EA teams is get that SA organization going. And that actually brings us to Bad-Bourbon-Biscuit asks, modern EA tools and solutions architecture. Our company is evaluating EA tools. The panel has been looking at newer SaaS players, LeanIX and RDoc, but we cannot find how they spot the solution architecture teams. Has anybody got much experience with either platform? We're open to older versions that spot traditional modeling, but are curious to know if the new age tools can spot both teams. I think this one's a hard one because the definition of solutions architecture, right? Where probably you and I are probably starting to get to that place in our minds, right? Where it's like that mesh of architects across business is good to have. And that to me is the solutions architect. So if they're what we would think about solutions architects, then LeanIX and RDoc should have those capabilities to manage solutions architecture life cycles as well.
I think the problem I have with enterprise architecture, so enterprise architecture and solution architecture, I think where people get a lot, like the confusion I've run into so far is the solution architect has to be aware of the enterprise and has to be in partnership with the enterprise, but can't get distracted by the enterprise. And I need you focused on the thing you're trying to solve for now. It is the reason it's solution, not enterprise, is because you are working on this project with these 1, 2, 3 teams, but you have a bounded scope of you have an outcome you need to accomplish and you need to do it for your stakeholders, business units, whatever it is. Whereas the enterprise architecture is the one looking at it and going, okay, but it'd be really goofy if you all did the exact same thing over here in Snowflake that this team is doing over here in Postgres. Why don't we actually have the unified data backbone for both of you? But you as the solution architect need to own, and it's this weird thing where I probably feel like I'm a guy doing land grabs in all organizations because I'm like, that's a product role. I'm like, it's an engineering role, it's a product role, it's an architecture role, but it is that person who needs to understand. It's kind of that technical product manager, that business architect. It is the person who needs to be more heavily on the engineering side, but they need to understand the context of where they exist in the business.
Yeah, for sure. And so I don't see a lot of trouble with the modern EA tools holding the solution architecture. I'd say where it starts to fail is if you think of solutions architects in terms of like we're doing custom solutions development for a customer, then I'm thinking to myself, that's not really what I probably wouldn't track that.
Just use Jira or something.
Yeah, and
that is so LeanIX, RDoc. I think the thing I'd be mindful of if you have solution architects is the ownership of your slice of the enterprise meta model and the ability to narrow their view. So are these tools dropping me into the entire enterprise-wide meta model, and I, as the solution architect, every morning have to click 4 filters to get down to my project and my thing? Or are these tools supporting me as a solution architect, only focusing on the parts that I care about and the artifacts and the, you know, the objects within that are relevant to me? And it's not, it's one of those weird things where, like, sometimes I feel goofy being like, oh, it's 4 clicks to filter the thing. But 4 clicks to filter the thing every morning is that tiny bit of digital friction that ends up building up and mattering.
Yeah, so most of the modern ones, certainly with RDoc and LeanIX, they are, you do the heavy lift up front, and it's not heavy lift. Like it's a couple of hours, right? Where you're like, oh, cool, I want to go build my own dashboards, and I want to build my own views and my own filters and stuff like that. So yeah, when I log in, if I was a data architect and I only wanted to see my stuff, totally configurable, right? Like certainly with RDoc and LeanIX. But yeah, you really want to be focused on your own stuff, because I don't think people realize that, like, oh, well, we don't know what you do every day. And it's like, go look at the project list, right? I don't think people realize, like, you're talking about in excess of 100 conversations. Some won't go any further than idea. Some are real projects that are coming through the product pipelines, right? Some are things that came from IT that didn't even come through the product life cycle. So now you're trying to get things back up to the right level in the org to get bootstrapped.
Yeah.
But you have an excess of like 100 plus conversations going on at any one time, and it ranges from the NetOps conversations and all the way through to the SDLC and the ADRs. And yeah, you would want everything to reflect in the meta model.
Right.
It's better when you're partners, because you want the right disciplines to own the section of the meta model. I tend to err on the side of caution. So if you are implementing a modern EA tool or solutions architecture, and you want to put your solutions architecture in there, I warn you here, if you get a tool like that and you open it up to everyone and everyone's super energized, you're going to spend years cleaning up, because everyone's going to have their own idea of what the meta model looks like.
Sure.
So that is a warning. Anybody who's about to embark on those tools, that's part of the challenge, is you want to be very deliberate about building that meta model.
It's the confluence problem. You've allowed them to go and create whatever structure they want, and now it's permanently ruined.
Yeah, because you start to lose out on that versioning of the diagrams, right? Like, now you got the same problem. No one's going to go back and fix that meta model later.
Right.
So yeah, it's a weird one. And then just conceptually too, like enterprise architecture, it's not like Jira or something where you're not really deleting projects, or you're not really deleting initiatives. They're sort of aging out, or they're degrading in quality, right? And so that's a challenge too, is like, the EA world is not like the Jira world where there's a lot of deletes. It's more like archives, and you get your phased approaches, like, oh, well, this is phase 1 of a project. So the meta model handles all that, but it can get messy. It's a good life. Enterprise architecture is a good life. If you get top-down buy-in and you're in a company that really values it, man, what you learn, just even talking to like a decent business architect who's sitting in that weird spot, it's just such an amazing experience to work in a big company and see like the technology leaders not having the time to sort of coordinate and be like, how do we make decisions, right? Like, how do we make decisions around data when we got data coming in through organizations that don't even have time to plan the quarter, plan the year, right?
I feel like that could be an entire episode. How do you make decisions?
Yeah,
yeah.
Especially it's definitely a good one. We should do that soon, because it's been a conversation I've had a few times over the last probably year about not making any decisions, right? And like the fallout, because that can go on, right? You and I probably seen it in some big companies where inaction can go on for years. Like years, literally years.
And the weird thing about that is, in the moment, most of the people wouldn't tell you that they're being inactive.
Yes.
It feels like forward motion.
Even and getting back in the digital friction, like I often feel that day to day in meetings, right, throughout my whole career, where people are happy at the end of the meeting. I was like, I can feel happy too.
Why?
Like, does anybody know what we got from this? Who's gonna go do it, right? Like, and I often sit there and I'm like, oh, we all feel good, right? It's that trick. It's a trick.
Yep.
You all feel good, but there's no action items. Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, we should talk about that.
Yep. All right. RVY 474. Why does the front end never look as good as the designs?
I love this question.
It's a good one, right?
It's a
So
great one.
they go on to ask, the output of the front end engineering team never looks as good as the Figma designs. I'm not very design savvy, and often I don't have the vocabulary to explain what's missing, but it's obvious that the designs look great while the app looks like shit. Most of the time it's the little things like spacing, shadow, padding, alignment, etc. I think my designers are fine. We use Figma, create component libraries, and have started using some features in the developer mode too. The finesse and attention to detail is lost when developers code it in. How do you guys prevent this? Should I ask the designers to do a quality check? Should we set better expectations from the front end engineers? Is there something I'm not doing? And yeah, I think it's constantly a thing, and I think there's a couple of different answers. I'm curious if you've got a version of when you've seen this happen. I think part of it is it depends on the framework that you're working in, whether or not, and it depends on what your UX designers are doing in Figma. Figma can go and design whatever you want it to look like. They can put all of the spacing and shadow and padding that they want to. Have you converted all of that into rules that are in your component library? Are your engineers actually enabled to do that? Have you done that consistently, or is every Figma design the UX person is in the wild west of getting to design whatever they want? Because there is a disconnect between, okay, we have a component library, it makes the buttons look like this, it makes the tables look like this, it makes the headings look like this. If the UX designer gets to ignore all of that and do whatever they want, and they can perfectly pixel space the whatever thing, the front end engineer has no chance of doing that. There's no way for them to do that without spending an inordinate amount of time. And you don't want your front end engineer to do that. You want a UI framework that is, this is how you always do a save button. This is how you always do the refresh. This is how you always do a grid layout. Like, you want that to be componentized. And it sounds like in this case, they do have, a component library, and that should be possible, which gets into the second half of my answer, which is front end designers are as good as you tell them to be, or front end engineers are as good as the instructions you give to them. And so there's also just a degree of how well are you communicating, and maybe it is UX coming in and saying, actually, wait, why didn't you use component 5 like I designed? Okay, I'll make my Figma designs more clear. I don't know, there's a communication thing here. But yeah, I don't know. Most of the time my experience is because Figma can do way more than a UI engineer can. I don't know where you land on this one.
Yeah, I thought they were going somewhere a little different. I didn't think they were going to talk about the translation between the design and the UI. So I
Okay.
mean, it sounds like they're not happy with the quality of the engineers, then, right?
Right.
I don't know Sigma that well. I do know the code generation capabilities of it and building out rules. So it does seem like there's frameworks for unit testing and UX and UI, right? Like, I imagine style and things like that could be important. There's a way to test that stuff, right? I mean, there just is.
Yeah.
But if they're shoddy developers who are not actually taking designs and getting it right, then are they also going to build meaningful test cases or support the test framework?
And that is the point of the component library, is to move away from all of that. Like, a good implementation of a component library, you actually don't need a ton of Figma designs. You can get away with like a wireframe, because everyone knows when you see the black and white box on the screen that says card, button, whatever, like, oh, I'm just going to go use the card component. I don't need to design anything from scratch. I have that already in my component library. There's a bunch of cases where my answer to this is it's because you don't have a good component library. You're not enabling the front end developers to do that effectively.
But it's one thing to have the components, but if they look shoddy on the screen, right? Like, if I've got 3 cards and the one in the middle is like,
You built a bad component library then.
oh, so you're saying like the container as well should.
Right. That's the thing, is all of those things. And if your if your Figma designer is coming back and saying, oh, I want you to do this cool new thing, we've never done it before, the thing's going to slide out from the side, and when the user clicks on it, it fades away and does all of that, that's feedback for your UX manager or your UX designer, and say, okay, but have you told the engineers how to implement that? Have you worked with engineering to figure out how to do it? Like, there's a conversation here that needs to happen between product, UX, and engineering to make sure that everyone's on board with what the Figma designs are going to be. It's kind of like, did you ever see, this is going way back, in like 2004 maybe, there's a team that did the preview of what the next version of Microsoft Windows was going to look like, and they used Power Director or some tool that does UI designs, and they pitched that Longhorn, the next version version of Windows was going to have this fancy rotating device manager and folders were going to go and do magic transitions and do all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, because they were in a design tool that they could just paint whatever they wanted to paint. No one double checked with the actual Windows engineers that they could do that. And of course, what we got was Windows Vista, which didn't do any of that because it couldn't, because you let the designers go crazy without actually making sure that engineering was involved. And then the other half of it is, I think engineering sometimes wants the path of least resistance, and that's not always great. Like, yeah, guys, sometimes you do need to spend 2 weeks building this little new component that's going to do the thing. I don't know. My answer to this is everyone needs to talk to each other better. Everyone's a little bit at fault when you find yourself in this situation.
It's UI too, so it's not real engineering.
Oh, shots fired. Hot take.
I mean,
incorrect.
It's not like high performance stuff, right? Just
You've clearly never tried to get a React app to be fast in a mobile browser. Well,
I mean, look what
alienating any of our
where
UX.
the no-code, low-code movement started, right? Like, it tackled the easiest stuff first. You know?
No, it made horrible UIs. They are terrible data entry form UIs.
Flood a flop and create a mobile app in about 2 hours. UI
with a terrible UI.
I'm standing by all those back-end engineers out there. I got you guys.
Yep.
Keeping the stock market running for decades.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. To read articles that we've written on similar topics to the ones we talk about here, head over to the blog at acceptancepod.com. You can also follow us on most apps. We're at AcceptancePod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog over there.
We're also building a community on Reddit at r/acceptancecriteria, or you can find us on Discord. Once there, you'll find links to show notes and other artifacts you'll find on our blog. We promise to moderate the heck out of anything submitted to the team to keep it a nice little slice of the internet.
For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at ktomasuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER, and this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.